This episode is called The Man with the Blue Skin. Just before 8 a.m. on the morning of September 25th, 1944, a police officer patrolled Day Street in Lower Manhattan in New York City. He passed the usual morning bustle, factory workers leaving the subway, telephone operators on their way to the nearby telephone and telegraph building, a food truck unloading vegetables at a dingy corner market, and someone begging for change outside an abandoned warehouse. Then, the officer noticed what looked like a heap of clothing just lying on the sidewalk ahead of him. The officer sighed and shook his head. He hated litter and took a lot of pride in keeping his streets clean. So, the officer approached this pile of clothes, looking for a trash can to dump it in. But as he got closer, the officer realized this pile of clothes was actually an elderly man in a shabby overcoat. He was doubled over and clutching his stomach. The officer felt annoyed as the smell of stale alcohol and body odor rose from the old man's coat. He figured this man was just drunk after a long night out. So the officer bent down and shook the man's shoulder, asking if he was okay. Then, without warning, the old man turned over and vomited onto the sidewalk. The officer jumped back to avoid getting puke on his shoes. This old man was clearly very drunk and so could not be left on the streets alone. The officer had no choice but to arrest him for public intoxication. But as the officer reached for his handcuffs, he stopped because he noticed something very odd about this old man. His nose, lips, ears, and fingers were all as blue as the sky above. It was so strange that it took a moment for the officer to register what he was even seeing. Then, between this guy's blue skin, the glazed-over look on his face, and the vomit on the sidewalk, it clicked. This was not public intoxication, this was a medical emergency. So the officer ran to a payphone and called dispatch and requested an ambulance. Luckily, there was an emergency room close by at Beekman Downtown Hospital. The hospital was only 6 blocks away, so an ambulance arrived in just a matter of minutes. The officer helped one of the emergency responders hoist the old man off the sidewalk and onto a stretcher, and then they loaded him into the back of the ambulance. The officer took a step back as the ambulance driver closed the door and then sped away. After the ambulance had disappeared around the corner and the police officer had resumed his beat, he thought to himself, in all his years on the force, that might have been the strangest thing he'd ever come across. A few minutes later, an attending physician named Dr. Francis Stevens ran outside of Beekman Downtown Hospital. He'd been notified about the incoming patient with the sky blue skin, and now he was rushing to meet the ambulance, pulling up out in front. Dr. Stevens helped the ambulance driver pull out a stretcher, and then using it, they carried the old man inside. The driver explained that although the old man had been awake when he was loaded into the ambulance, he had lost consciousness during the short drive to the hospital. Dr. Stevens nodded, guessing that his new patient had likely passed out from shock. He could tell from the man's skin color alone that his heart must not be pumping enough blood through his body, which meant he was at risk of a heart attack. As they transferred the old man from his stretcher to an actual hospital bed, Dr. Stevens saw that nearly half of this man's body had turned blue. Dr. Stevens jumped into action. They only had minutes to supply the old man's body with oxygen and then get his heart to pump it through his bloodstream. Without immediate treatment, this man would die. Dr. Stevens figured that the old man must have ingested something that made him this sick, so he raced to pump the man's stomach until he was sure it was empty. This meant that whatever had made him sick hopefully would not be able to do any more damage. The doctor then strapped an oxygen mask over the old man's face to increase the oxygen in his blood and then gave him stimulants to help his heart pump more efficiently. After this, there was nothing to do but wait. Dr. Stevens looked at the old man lying unconscious in the bed, his skin still bright blue, and the doctor just hoped they had treated him in time to save his life. Later that morning, Dr. Stevens returned to check on the old man and found him lying in bed, fully awake. His lips and fingertips did have a bluish tinge still, but the effect clearly had dramatically lessened. The man said his name was William and that he was 82 years old, and then after that he began looking around the room with very suspicious eyes and demanded to know what had happened to him. Dr. Stevens told William that he had been suffering from a condition known as cyanosis that results from inadequate oxygen in the bloodstream. Cyanosis is known for causing people's skin to turn blue. It was a rare condition, and they weren't sure why William had gotten it. Although Dr. Stevens could assure William that for the time being, the best treatment available was just to rest. This answer did not seem to satisfy William because his next question was, well, when do I get to go home? But before Dr. Stevens could answer him, the doors of the emergency room burst open and another unconscious man was carried into the waiting room. Dr. Stevens rushed from William's side to help this new patient. As the man was laid onto a bed, Dr. Stevens stopped and just stared at him with a look of surprise on his face. This new patient was also an old man dressed in tattered clothes, and as Dr. Stevens bent over him, he noticed that, just like William, this old man's lips, nose, and fingers were also bright blue. So Dr. Stevens administered the same treatment he'd just given William: a stomach pump, an oxygen mask, and heart stimulants. But as he was working on this new patient, Dr. Stevens started to have this sinking feeling in his gut. 2 cyanosis cases on the same day? What was that about? He knew that in rare cases, cyanosis was a symptom of carbon monoxide poisoning. He worried that there might be a gas leak in a nearby building, and in a neighborhood as crowded as Lower Manhattan, that could be disastrous. Dr. Stevens was able to stabilize this new patient's condition, but the doctor didn't have a moment to rest. Almost immediately after the second patient was stable, he heard another ambulance pull up out front, and seconds later, 3 more people were carried in. And from across the room, Dr. Stevens could already see that all 3 of them were elderly, run-down men, and they were all bright blue. Now, Beekman Downtown Hospital had a total of 5 cyanosis patients. Dr. Stevens and his staff worked through the entire morning to save these 3 new blue patients, and then just before lunch, 2 more blue men were carried in, and 10 minutes later, another 2. Dr. Stevens was totally confused. Something in the city had to be making all these men sick, but it just was not clear what it was. By noon, there were 9 ragged elderly men who had blue skin who were laid out in the hospital's beds. Dr. Stevens and his staff ran from bed to bed, administering treatment until all 9 men were totally stabilized and their skin was slowly turning back to its normal color. It was only then that Dr. Stevens had a moment to step back and actually go look at the men's admission papers. These documents revealed that all of the men had been found on sidewalks or in condemned buildings all around the neighborhood. Dr. Stevens didn't know what to make of this, but the fact that the men were coming from different places meant that a single gas leak probably could not have made them all sick. But if it wasn't gas poisoning, what was making these men turn blue? Dr. Stevens worried it could be some kind of airborne illness or virus, and so even though Dr. Stevens did not really know what was going on, he knew it was now time to report this outbreak to the Department of Health. About an hour later, a field epidemiologist with the New York Department of Health named Dr. Ottavio Pelletieri walked through the doors of Beekman Downtown Hospital. He showed his identification to the receptionist and asked to speak with the physician who was in charge. Dr. Pelletieri's job was to investigate possible outbreaks of disease. His eyes wandered around the emergency room. Of the 9 blue-skinned patients laying in the beds against the wall, only 5 of them were awake. Dr. Pelletieri focused on William, who was the first patient brought in that morning. William was sitting upright in his bed, his skin still somewhat blue, but he was clearly feeling better. Dr. Pelletieri walked over and introduced himself. He asked William about his morning. The old man coughed into his fist and then thought for a moment. He said at first it was just an ordinary day. He'd woken up in a nearby rooming house called the Globe Hotel, which was a crumbling, dingy building filled with as many twin beds as possible. After waking up, William said that he wandered down to breakfast at the Eclipse cafeteria, where low-income people could get a hot meal very cheap. He ate some oatmeal and drank some coffee, and then started back to his boarding house. And when he reached the sidewalk right outside of the Globe Hotel, he suddenly started feeling these stabbing pains inside of his stomach. Then he fell to the ground, and the next thing he knew, he was in this hospital bed. Just as Dr. Pelletieri was about to open his mouth to ask William some follow-up questions, the cyanosis patient in the next bed over piped up and said that he also had eaten at the Eclipse cafeteria that morning. Dr. Pelletieri raised his eyebrows. He stepped away from William's bed and asked the 5 conscious patients if they'd also eaten at Eclipse that morning. And all of them nodded yes, they had. Dr. Pelletieri now knew where to start his investigation. Something obviously was wrong at the Eclipse cafeteria. The question was whether there was a carbon monoxide leak there or if something else in the restaurant had made these men sick. It could be food poisoning, though Dr. Pelletieri thought this was unlikely since the symptoms of food poisoning usually take at least 12 hours to manifest, and these men had passed out from pain and shock within just minutes of leaving the Eclipse cafeteria. Dr. Pelletieri then thought of something else that could have caused this quick and sudden illness. He took another sweeping look at the 5 conscious men in front of him and told them he had one more question. He promised they would not be in trouble, but he just had to know whether any of them had used a drug such as heroin that morning. There was a pause as the men stared back at him, but then all of them shook their heads no, and then told Dr. Pelletieri that they were actually drinkers, not drug users. They were all so serious that Dr. Pelletieri immediately believed them. Just then, a nurse walked up behind Dr. Pelletieri and tapped him on the shoulder. She pointed across the room to Dr. Stevens, the ER doctor, who was striding toward him. Dr. Pelletieri gave Dr. Stevens a nod and met him halfway across the room, extending a handshake. After the men shook hands, Dr. Pelletieri explained that he would need blood samples from all 9 patients. They'd be sent to the city toxicologist for overnight testing. Dr. Stevens nodded and agreed to help. For the next 10 minutes, the 2 of them moved from patient to patient, collecting small vials of blood and labeling them carefully. By the time they were done, all but one of the cyanosis patients were awake. The only one who remained asleep was a man named John Marshall. He was laid out in the bed closest to the wall, fully unconscious, skin still pale blue. Dr. Pelletieri looked John up and down before labeling his blood and placing it in a small box with the other samples. It was clear to Dr. Pelletieri that whatever had made these men sick, John must have gotten the worst of it. Dr. Pelletieri grabbed his briefcase full of samples and then left the emergency room. He dropped the samples at his office for testing and then head straight to the Eclipse cafeteria. If he could figure out what had happened, there might still be time to save John's life. Around 5 o'clock that afternoon, Dr. Pelletieri arrived at the Eclipse cafeteria to find it closed and locked up. But the lights were on inside, so the doctor knocked on the dingy glass door. When there was no answer, he knocked again, announcing himself loudly as a member of the health department. Finally, he saw someone inside pop out of the kitchen and hurry across the dining room. The man was dressed in a well-tailored trench coat and wore a suit. He unlocked the front door and opened it for Dr. Pelletieri and then introduced himself as Mr. Weinberg and said he was from the New York Bureau of Food and Drugs. He explained to Dr. Pelletieri that a secretary from the New York Department of Health had already called his office. Now that a restaurant was potentially responsible for the cyanosis outbreak, his department needed to be involved. Dr. Pelletieri felt grateful for the unexpected help, and so he stepped inside of the Eclipse cafeteria, and right away he was hit with this horrible smell. It was like an algae-filled aquarium. Dr. Pelletieri thought there must be so much mold lurking behind all the filthy and cracked tile walls. This place was so overdue for a proper cleaning that an inch of black grit clung to every corner of the floor. Dr. Pelletieri looked around the rest of the room, and he saw fruit flies climbing the walls. There were 17 rickety tables that filled the dining room, each with its own sticky bottle of ketchup and salt and pepper shakers. Weinberg told Dr. Pelletieri that he had not found a gas leak anywhere inside, but he'd already cited the cafeteria with 15 separate health code violations. The kitchen was even more disgusting than the dining room. A thick layer of grease clung to every surface, bags of rotting garbage sat beneath the kitchen sinks. Dr. Pelletieri picked up a fork lying on the counter, and a thick layer of starch coated the fork prongs. To him, everything inside of this cafe was a potential contaminant. It was only then that Dr. Pelletieri noticed the cook and the restaurant owner standing beside the oven. Dr. Pelletieri was even more surprised to find that both men looked genuinely upset, maybe even afraid. Dr. Pelletieri felt relieved. Usually, restaurant owners were combative when the health department showed up, but he guessed that these men were going to be cooperative. If they had something to do with these 9 men getting sick, it seemed very much like it was an accident. Dr. Pelletieri wanted to speak with the line cook first. He asked the man if he did anything different than usual when he cooked breakfast that morning. The line cook shook his head and said no. He had made the usual breakfast of oatmeal, rolls, and coffee, nothing different than every other morning. Dr. Pelletieri then followed the cook to the pantry, taking note of the type of dry cereal the cook had used to make 6 gallons of oatmeal. Then the cook led Dr. Pelletieri to the giant metal stock pot that he had used to both cook the oatmeal and then serve the oatmeal, enough to serve 125 people that morning. The cook rattled off the recipe: 5 pounds of that dry cereal, 4 gallons of city tap water, and a handful of salt. The cook gestured to a gallon can of salt sitting on the stove, and then he pointed to a series of canisters sitting on a shelf just above the stove. The cook explained they stored the salt there in bulk, then just refilled the salt can on the stove as needed. Dr. Pelletieri said he wanted to take samples from everything the men had cooked with that morning. Then the doctor grabbed a step stool to reach the canisters labeled table salt above the oven. And when he was up there and was eye level with these canisters, he noticed there was a different canister hidden amongst them, one that did not have a label. Dr. Pelletieri lifted that can off the shelf and looked inside, and to him, it just looked like table salt. But just to be sure, Dr. Pelletieri climbed down from the stepladder and then showed this unlabeled can of white crystals to the cook and said, "What is this?" The cook explained that this can contained something known as saltpeter, which was a preservative he used to make corned beef and pastrami. The cook said he did not use the saltpeter to make oatmeal. For that, he used regular table salt. Dr. Pelletieri nodded, but just in case, he took a small sample of the saltpeter with him. For a moment, Dr. Pelletieri wondered if maybe there had been some kind of a mix-up and the cook had used saltpeter instead of table salt. But even if that had been the case, that would not have been what made all 9 of those men sick. Saltpeter was not toxic. Once Dr. Pelletieri had a bag full of all the samples he needed, he left the Eclipse cafeteria, hoping he would never have to return. Then he headed for the health department chemist's office. He needed these samples tested for poison overnight, along with the blood samples that he'd dropped off earlier. Dr. Pelletieri really wanted to get back to the hospital to check in on the 9 patients. But first, he had to make sure that this cyanosis outbreak was contained and that he was aware of every single cyanosis patient being treated right now in the city. He spent the next several hours visiting every cheap rooming house in the neighborhood, as well as all the nearby hospitals, until he was certain that the only cyanosis victims that were being dealt with right now were the 9 at the Beekman Downtown Hospital. When Dr. Pelletieri finally returned to the Beekman Downtown Hospital, it was well after midnight. And when he got there, a nurse greeted him and told him that since he had left the hospital that afternoon, 2 more elderly men had arrived with cyanosis, so blue skin. That brought the official count up to 11. Most of them were awake now and back to their normal coloring, but the sickest patient, John Marshall, still lay unconscious in his bed by the wall, and his situation seemed to only be getting worse. Dr. Pelletieri frowned and then thanked the nurse for the update. Then he headed back out the door toward his office to write his initial report summarizing his investigation for his boss, Dr. Morris Greenberg, the city's chief epidemiologist. The next morning, Dr. Pelletieri had to go back to the Eclipse cafeteria, even though he really didn't want to. He was exhausted, having stayed up most of the night writing his report for his boss. But to continue his investigation, he would need to speak with more members of the kitchen staff. When he got there, the cafeteria was still closed because of the health department citations, but the busboys and cashiers were waiting for Dr. Pelletieri inside the dining room. He chatted with each of them, following them around the cafeteria as they pantomimed their workdays. It didn't take long for Dr. Pelletieri to conclude that their actions had not contributed to the cyanosis cases in any significant way. But as Dr. Pelletieri packed up his belongings and got ready to leave, the cook from the day before appeared in the dining room with a fearful look on his face. He admitted to Dr. Pelletieri that he'd been up all night worrying that maybe, just maybe, he did accidentally season the oatmeal with saltpeter, not table salt, and if so, he was incredibly sorry. Dr. Pelletieri clapped the man's shoulder and thanked him for the honesty, but assured him not to worry. Since saltpeter is edible, it would not have hurt anyone if he had made that mix-up. The cook visibly relaxed, and Dr. Pelletieri smiled and wished him a good afternoon. Within an hour, Dr. Pelletieri made it back to the Department of Health to find a note on his desk from his supervisor, Dr. Greenberg. The test results from all the Eclipse cafeteria food samples had come back, and Greenberg wanted to see Dr. Pelletieri immediately. Dr. Greenberg was sitting at his desk, looking over the results, when Dr. Pelletieri showed up and knocked on his doorframe. Greenberg looked up for a moment and waved Dr. Pelletieri in. And then once Dr. Pelletieri took a seat, Greenberg handed him a copy of the results. And as Dr. Pelletieri read the findings, his eyes went wide. The cook had, in fact, accidentally refilled the gallon can of salt on his stove with saltpeter instead of table salt. But that was not the issue. The problem was that both the table salt and the saltpeter contained measurable levels of sodium nitrite, a meat preservative that can be poisonous if not handled carefully. Dr. Pelletieri knew that sodium nitrite wasn't dangerous in small doses, but large quantities of it could be deadly. For a moment, Dr. Pelletieri wondered how sodium nitrite could have gotten into the kitchen in the first place. It was more common at processing plants where meats like salami, hot dogs, and bacon were cured. And then Dr. Pelletieri remembered that because the nation was in the middle of World War II, the government had approved the use of limited concentrations of sodium nitrite in restaurants to make foods last longer. The sodium nitrite had to be used in very low concentrations that would preserve the meat, but allow any poisonous elements to burn off during the cooking process. But there was a big problem with the way the Eclipse cafeteria was using their sodium nitrite. The cooks were not just using it to preserve meat. They were also using it to season the morning oatmeal. And this was a critical mistake because oatmeal is not cooked nearly as long as meat is. During the longer meat cooking process, the toxins in sodium nitrite evaporate. But with oatmeal, they don't evaporate, and so when the cooks served it to the men, the toxins were definitely still in the oatmeal. And if that was not enough poison, the 11 men who were hospitalized had apparently gotten a whole lot more sodium nitrite straight from the salt shaker on their tables. Lab tests showed that one of the shakers at the Eclipse contained excess sodium nitrite, easily enough to sicken someone. Dr. Pelletieri put the lab results down and smiled. He finally had his answer. He would tell the restaurant about the mix-up right away, and as for the 11 blue men at the hospital, they were unlikely to suffer any long-term health problems from what had happened to them. Dr. Pelletieri thanked Dr. Greenberg, then got up to go spread the good news. That evening, Dr. Pelletieri stopped by the Beekman downtown emergency room on his way home. When he arrived, he learned that 10 of the 11 blue men had been released with a clean bill of health. When he called Dr. Greenberg to let him know, Greenberg said it was nothing short of a miracle. All of the survivors were self-proclaimed alcoholics, and alcoholics often crave salt. He was sure that all of them added salt liberally to their food, unwittingly putting their lives in danger. Dr. Pelletieri agreed, and he wanted to tell these men how lucky they were, but the survivors had been discharged and had all returned to their transient lives out on the streets. He knew he would likely never find them again. Still, they were part of a special group, survivors of being poisoned with sodium nitrite, an event so rare there were only 10 other cases of it ever in recorded history. But that was no help for the 11th blue man, John Marshall. His health had been so bad prior to consuming this sodium nitrite that he had died earlier that evening. Dr. Pelletieri's throat felt tight when he heard that news. He'd conducted his investigation as quickly as possible, but it still was not fast enough to save everyone. On Friday, April 17th, 1993, 59-year-old millionaire Dale Uell was flying his Beechcraft Bonanza single-engine airplane thousands of feet above Fresno, California. Dale was a handsome man with blue eyes and dark hair that was starting to turn gray. He was flying his plane from where he lived in Fresno to a small airport about 45 minutes away because he was going to meet his wife and kids at the family's beach house for Easter weekend. In the cockpit, Dale looked out at the clear blue sky and listened to the hum of the plane's engine, and suddenly any stress he might have been dealing with just kind of disappeared. Airplanes had been a huge part of Dale's life for almost 40 years, and he never felt better than when he was flying. In the 1950s, Dale had flown twin-engine turboprop planes as a member of the United States Air Force, and then after he left the military, Dale had gotten a job selling small airplanes to private pilots and California ranchers for a company owned by a man named Frank Lamb. Frank had taken Dale under his wing and taught him everything he could about the airplane industry, and Dale had turned out to be a very gifted airplane salesman. Part of Dale's skill as a salesman was that he was very charming and he felt comfortable talking to all kinds of people, but really the main reason Dale had been so successful at selling planes was because his love of being a pilot really rubbed off on people. And when he talked to potential clients about the peace and the awe he felt when he was flying, they wanted to experience the same thing. And so Dale had quickly moved up the company ladder, and when Frank had stepped away from the business 20 years earlier, Dale had taken over and become the owner and president of the company. Once Dale was in charge, he had started making a lot of money, and he invested that money really well. So in 1992, as Dale approached his 60th birthday, he was worth about $8 million, which would be over $17 million in 2023. When Dale got to be about 20 miles away from the airport where he was going, he radioed air traffic control and got clearance to make his final approach. Dale descended to an altitude of about 2,000 feet and then started the landing procedure. And when he touched down on the runway, he was already looking forward to flying again in a couple of days. But first, he was eager to spend some time relaxing with his family. Dale got into a car that he had arranged to have waiting for him at the airport, and then he drove a few miles to Pajaro Dunes, a small upscale beachfront community in Northern California. He made his way down a secluded street past large homes that looked out onto the Pacific Ocean, and then finally he pulled up to his own beach house, he parked his car, and stepped outside. His wife, Glee, and his daughter, Tiffany, were sitting on the porch waiting for him. Glee and Tiffany had driven to the beach house together the day before. Glee, who had short brown hair and a big smile, stood up and kissed her husband when he stepped onto the porch. Glee and Dale had been married for 31 years, and when they had started making a lot of money, Glee had really committed herself to community service and philanthropy. And so as a result, back in Fresno where they lived, Glee was admired as a community leader. But Glee had a past that most people in Fresno didn't know anything about. She was extremely smart and she had a talent for speaking foreign languages. And in the late 1950s, before she and Dale had gotten married, Glee's skills had landed her a job in South America as a translator for the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, which is a federal agency in the United States that specializes in foreign intelligence. Glee's children thought it was exciting that their mom had once worked for the CIA, but Glee thought about her time in South America like it was from a different life. On the porch, Glee and Dale's daughter, Tiffany, got up and hugged her dad. Then she opened the door, and they all went inside the beach house. Tiffany was 24 years old, with cropped blonde hair and a smile that was almost identical to her mother's. She was quiet and reserved around people she didn't know, and in fact, she'd been named the shyest person in class when she was in college. But Tiffany's family and her few close friends knew she was funny and sweet and a great person to talk to once she'd let her guard down. So Dale, Glee, and Tiffany spent a lot of that day just talking to each other, and their main topic of conversation was the youngest member of the family, Dana, and his new girlfriend, Monica Zent. The two had met at their dorm at Santa Clara University, which was a little over an hour from the beach house. And the next day, Dana was supposed to bring Monica out to the beach house to meet the rest of his family. The following morning, 20-year-old Dana Uell pulled up to the front of the beach house in his gold Mercedes-Benz, and he, along with his girlfriend, Monica, got out of the car and walked towards the front door. Dana was tall and thin with dark brown hair, and this day he wore a t-shirt and jeans. But that outfit was actually kind of unusual for him. Most of the time, when Dana went anywhere, even to his college classes, he wore a tailored Armani suit, which is very fancy. Dana looked up to his father, and he really wanted to be successful like his dad was, and so he thought it was important to dress the part. Dana and Monica walked inside the beach house, and Dana right away called out for his parents. Monica looked around the large front room and listened to the sound of the ocean just outside, and she was kind of in shock. Monica's father was an FBI agent, so she had not grown up around people who had as much money as Dana and his family. So the gold Mercedes, the beachfront property, the airplanes, and the whole lifestyle the Uells led was just all so new to her. Dale, Glee, and Tiffany came into the front room from the kitchen and said hello to Dana and Monica. Then Glee asked Monica to go on a tour of the beach house, really just so Glee could get to know her son's new girlfriend a little bit better. And later that day, while Monica was spending time with Glee and also with Tiffany, Dana and Dale went to play tennis on a court that was reserved just for residents of this small beach community. As they played, Dale talked to his son about the airplane business, but he really wanted to hear about how Dana was doing at school. Dana said classes were going great and that he really liked his girlfriend, Monica, so he was excited that the family was finally getting to meet her. Dana also said that he really hoped the entire family would get to spend more time together as a whole once this semester was over. And then the two of them started talking about their favorite topic, flying. Dana said that he wanted to get into piloting helicopters, so his dad, Dale, said they should find a good place for him to take lessons that was not too far from school. They played tennis for a bit longer, and then they headed back to the beach house. Later that night, a few hours after dinner, Dale and his wife Glee were lying in bed, and they began talking about how lucky they were to have this beach house, this really nice place where the whole family could go and spend time together and just kind of be away from everything for a little while. Glee said that she knew the kids were growing up and they had their own lives and interests, but she just hoped that Dana and Tiffany would keep coming to the beach house even when they were older and had families of their own. On April 19th, the following day, Dale helped his wife and his daughter load up Glee's gray Cadillac with the suitcases and cooler of food that they had brought to the beach. Dana and Monica were going to have Easter dinner with Monica's parents, so they had already left. Once Glee's car was loaded, Dale gave his wife and his daughter a kiss and told them he'd see them when he got home. Then Dale got into his own car and drove to the airport so he could fly his plane back to Fresno. Tiffany climbed into the passenger seat of the Cadillac, and Glee got behind the wheel, and then a couple of minutes later, they began their drive back home. It would take them 3 hours to complete the drive, but they made a pit stop about halfway through and grabbed some food at a fast food restaurant called Foster's Freeze, which was Tiffany's favorite place to get a milkshake. Finally, at about 5 p.m., Glee and Tiffany pulled into the driveway of their large ranch-style house in a secluded, wealthy neighborhood in Fresno. The house had a sprawling front yard that was beautifully landscaped with huge trees and a stone fountain in the center of the yard. Glee opened the garage door and pulled the Cadillac inside. Dale's car wasn't there, but that didn't surprise her. Even though the flight Dale had made was short, Glee knew he would spend some time at the airport making sure everything was all right with his plane. Tiffany got out of the car. She was carrying her drink from Foster's Freeze. Glee went around to the back seat, grabbed the cooler, and then followed Tiffany into their house. Once they were inside, Glee stopped to put the cooler down, but Tiffany kept on walking, and she disappeared down a hallway that led to the kitchen. Then, Glee thought that she heard something fall onto the floor down the hall, so she called out to Tiffany, but Tiffany didn't call back. So Glee walked into the hallway where Tiffany had just been, and when she did, she screamed, turned around, and started running. That night, Dana sat at the dinner table with his girlfriend Monica and her parents at Monica's parents' house. They had just finished a large Easter dinner, and Dana thanked Monica's parents for letting him spend the holiday with them. Then, not long after that, Dana and Monica drove back to their college campus in Dana's car. When they got to Dana's dorm room, he called home, but nobody answered. Dana thought it was odd that they were not picking up because he figured by now his family would be back from the beach, but Monica told him that they might have gone out for Easter dinner, or maybe they had all been worn out from the trip and just went straight to bed. But the following afternoon, Dana called home again after his classes, and there still was not any answer. So Dana called his father's office. And his father's assistant said that Dale had not checked in with her that day, but she thought it was possible that maybe Dale was just taking another day off after Easter. Dana said it seemed really strange to him that his dad had not even called the office to let her know. Dana finally hung up the phone, and then he went to find Monica in her dorm room. And as soon as Monica saw him, she knew something was wrong. Dana was pacing back and forth, and he had a really worried look on his face. Monica asked what was going on, and he told her that he still couldn't get a hold of his parents or his sister. Monica stood up and walked over to him and put her hands on his shoulders and tried to get him to calm down. And she said if he was really worried, he could totally call her dad because he was an FBI agent and he would know what to do. Dana said he really was worried, so Monica did call her father and then handed the phone over to Dana. Dana thanked Monica's dad for talking with him, and then he told him what was going on with his family. And Monica's dad pretty much immediately urged Dana to just stay calm, and then he also told Dana that, he would be happy to look around on his end to see if he could learn anything about what was going on with them. Later that day, Monica's dad would call Dana back, and even though he didn't have much information, what he did know was the Uell's home security alarm company had not gotten any indication that the alarm had gone off or that anything out of the ordinary had occurred at the house. After hearing this, Dana did feel a bit more relaxed, and Monica would say to him that, probably he just missed his family at the house when he had called. Dana figured she was right, and he told her that he would just try to get a hold of them in the morning if they still had not contacted him by then. The next day at 9 a.m., so this was April 21st, 2 days after Glee and her daughter Tiffany had gotten back to their home in Fresno, the Uell's housekeeper walked up to their front door, unlocked it with a key that she had, and she went inside. She was surprised that the alarm didn't beep when she walked in. The family was usually gone when she was there, and they almost always set the alarm when they left. So the housekeeper called out for Glee to see if she was home, but nobody responded. Then the housekeeper walked through the foyer into the living room that had high vaulted ceilings, and she got scared. Cushions from the couch were on the floor, and pictures had been pulled off the wall. The housekeeper called out to Glee again, but still nobody responded. And so the housekeeper took a breath and tried to calm her nerves, but when she walked into the hallway that led to the kitchen, she immediately screamed and ran back through the house out the front door, and when she got out there, she just happened to see a man walking towards her, and she began screaming out at him. The man tried to figure out what was going on. He would say that he was the Uell's neighbor and that their son, Dana, had called him that morning because Dana was worried about his parents. The housekeeper just shook her head, started to cry, and pointed to the Uell's front door. The neighbor would go inside, and he would see the house was a total mess. Then he too stepped into the hallway, and immediately he ran to the phone and dialed 911. A few minutes after that 911 call, the sound of police sirens cut through the quiet morning in the Uell's wealthy Fresno neighborhood. Lead investigator John Souza of the Fresno County Sheriff's Department parked his car in front of the Uell's house and stepped outside. It was a warm spring day, about 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Souza was short with dark hair and a thick mustache, and it was bright out, so he had his sunglasses on. From behind his glasses, he could see that the police sirens had already attracted a crowd. People up and down the street were now standing on their lawns, just staring over at the Uell's house, wondering what was going on. Detective Souza saw the Uell's housekeeper and their neighbor, who had called 911, standing outside. The housekeeper was inconsolable, and the neighbor looked like he was still in shock. So Souza walked up to them and tried to calm them down and told them everything was okay now, and then at some point the neighbor told Souza what he had seen inside of the Uell's house. Another squad car pulled up, and Deputy Chris Curtis got out. He was young and tall with light brown hair. Souza asked the neighbor and the housekeeper to please wait outside, and he told them that other officers would arrive soon to ask them more questions. Then Souza took off his sunglasses and waved Deputy Curtis over to him, and then the two of them walked into the Uell's house together. Every room Souza and Curtis walked through inside of the house looked like it had been totally ransacked. Souza had spent his early days in law enforcement in the robbery unit, and he told Curtis that in all his time investigating robberies, he'd never seen a house in this state. It was like whoever had done this had opened and emptied virtually every cabinet and drawer and littered the floor with everything the Uells owned. Then Souza and Curtis walked down the hall towards the kitchen, and they found the first body. Dale was lying face down, dead in the hallway. A pool of dried blood had formed under his face, and several unopened newspapers were scattered across the floor. Souza thought it looked like rigor mortis had already started to set in on the body. Rigor mortis is when muscles in a body stiffen after death, and so Souza wondered if Dale had been dead for days. Souza and Curtis walked further down the hall, they came to the kitchen, and they stopped again, because on the kitchen floor, they saw Tiffany lying face down like her father. Blood had run across the kitchen floor, and a drink had spilled nearby. Then they went back into the hall, walked into a home office, and found the third body. Glee was lying on her side, and massive amounts of blood had pooled behind her. Not long after Souza and Curtis found Glee, the forensics team arrived and started looking for evidence on and around the bodies. and while they did that, Souza and Curtis searched the rest of the house. The door to the main bedroom was open, and Souza could see that the bedroom looked even more torn apart than the rest of the house. He and Curtis walked into the room and saw that every drawer of a large wooden dresser had been opened and clothes were all over the floor. Souza walked over to a vanity table and saw an open jewelry box that had been emptied. It seemed clear that whoever had killed the Uells had also stolen valuable items from this jewelry box. So Souza thought there was a chance this was just a robbery gone wrong, that the Uells had just come home at the worst time, and when they walked in on the robbers panicked and killed them all. After doing an initial search of the house, Souza and Curtis joined the forensics team near Dale's body. Forensics officers had found Dale's wallet nearby, but it had been cleaned out, and that supported the idea that robbery could have been the motive behind these killings. But then, forensics officers told Souza something that he was not expecting to hear. Based on the wounds on the bodies, they believed the Uells had been shot with a semi-automatic 9mm pistol. But there was no murder weapon and not a single bullet casing had been left behind. And they said the weapon used and the way in which the victims were killed was like something they had seen in professional hits carried out by drug cartels. They also told Souza that they found small yellow fibers on all three bodies, but they'd have to run tests on these fibers to know what they were. Souza didn't know what to make of any of that. On the surface, nothing about the Uells led him to believe they were mixed up in drug smuggling or some criminal enterprise. But Souza knew enough not to rule anything out. So, as more members of his investigative team arrived, Souza sent them out to interview the Uells' neighbors. Then, Souza got word from his boss that Dana Uell was on his way to the sheriff's station with an FBI agent, and Souza needed to go see them. At around noon, so 3 hours after the bodies had been discovered, Dana sat with his girlfriend Monica and her father, the FBI agent, in a small office in the Fresno County Sheriff's Department. Dana had called his parents' neighbor to ask him to check on the house. After the neighbor found the bodies and called 911, he had called Dana back and told Dana he needed to come home right now. But when Dana asked what was going on, the neighbor just kept saying over and over that he just needed to come home. Right after that, Dana had found Monica, and they called Monica's dad, the FBI agent. Dana said he knew something had to be really wrong, even if the neighbor wouldn't say what it was. And so using his law enforcement contacts, Monica's dad found out what had happened, and he had called ahead to the Fresno Sheriff's Department to let them know that he and Dana would be there soon. Then Dana, Monica, and her dad had flown to Fresno and headed right to the Sheriff's Department. In the office, Monica held Dana's hand tight. Dana hadn't heard all of the details, but he knew his parents and his sister were dead. Detective Souza and Deputy Curtis walked into the office, fresh from the crime scene. Souza told Dana right away how sorry he was about what had happened. In a quiet voice, Dana asked if there was anything he could do to help. And Souza said, well, I know your father was a wealthy businessman. Do you know if maybe he had any enemies in the corporate world? Dana looked up in surprise, and then looked at his girlfriend, and then over at her father, and then he looked up at Souza and said as far as he knew, his dad did not have any enemies. They talked a while longer, and anytime Dana had questions about the investigation process, he would look to Monica's dad for help. Monica's dad and Souza both explained that it could take a while to figure out exactly what had happened. So Dana said he would stay with his uncle, who lived close by, in case the police needed anything else from him. Souza thanked them all for coming in and said he'd be in touch soon. But the following day, Dana would reach out to Souza and he would tell him that he really needed to speak to the police again. And when Souza and Dana met for the second time in that same small office at the sheriff's department, Dana said he had not been completely honest the day before because he did not want to upset his girlfriend or his girlfriend's father. Souza was a little thrown off by this, but he said he understood, and then he asked Dana to tell him anything that might help police in their investigation. Dana told Souza that his father, Dale, did have one enemy that he was aware of, and his name was Frank Lamb, the man who had mentored his father and who had owned the airplane business before handing it over to Dale. Detective Souza thanked Dana for coming back in and for being honest with him. And later that day, Souza discovered that Frank Lamb had not just walked away from his company in the 1970s and sold it to Dale. It turned out Frank had been busted in a federal drug trafficking case, and when he got sent to prison for 3 years, Dale had swooped in and taken the company out from under him. A few days after the murder, Souza and Curtis went to meet Frank at his house. Frank, who was very soft-spoken and polite, quickly welcomed the investigators inside. Frank said he'd read about the deaths of Dale and his family, and regardless of whatever bad blood had existed between them, Frank was sad to hear about what had happened. Souza and Curtis pressed Frank about his connection to known drug smugglers that had landed him in prison back in the 1970s. Frank said he had no connection to any drug runners and that he had nothing to do with Dale's murder. Then he smiled at Souza and said, Dale was very selfish and a very hard guy to work with, so I wouldn't be surprised if Dale had made a lot of people angry over his career. Souza and Curtis left Frank's house with not much more to go on than what they had arrived with. Souza didn't necessarily trust Frank, but the idea that Frank had waited 20 years to exact some kind of revenge on Dale didn't seem right to Souza. Still, there were details at the crime scene that made it look like the murders could have been carried out by a hitman from a drug cartel. So Souza didn't want to totally dismiss Frank as a suspect. But later that week, Souza and Curtis made a discovery that seemed even more bizarre than the idea that the Uells were connected to a drug smuggling operation. They found out that Glee had once worked for the CIA. Souza reached out to the CIA, but the CIA was not forthcoming with many details. All Souza learned was that Glee had been a Spanish translator in South America for the CIA over 30 years earlier. So all of a sudden, Souza and his team wondered if Glee had been the target, and if the murders were somehow retribution for something she'd been involved in during her time in the agency. And that information about Glee's past somehow got out, and the media jumped all over it. Pretty soon, there were tabloid-style stories about the murdered millionaires with possible connections to international drug cartels and the CIA. With all this media attention, the spotlight got even brighter on the Fresno Sheriff's Department, and Dana and other members of the Uell family and some friends started to publicly question if Souza and his team were really up to the task here. Dana got so frustrated with the lack of progress and the crazy rumors swirling around about his family that he publicly compared Souza and Curtis to Bert and Ernie from Sesame Street, the kids show. Dana thought these two would never find the person who had killed his parents and his sister. Souza and his team tried to block out the noise and just stay focused on their investigation. And as they continued to turn over all the evidence in front of them, they realized that despite the possible links to drug cartels and the CIA, Souza came to believe that the case might be a lot simpler than that. The Uells were rich, and their house had been ransacked. But all the families in their neighborhood were rich too, and no other homes had been hit. So Souza wanted to focus on people who would have known how wealthy the Uells were and who had a direct connection to them. But when Souza and his team shifted their investigation in this direction, it became clear that anyone who went to school with Dana would have known about his family's money. Because not only did Dana walk around campus in expensive Armani suits, but his college newspaper had also done a story about him. And in that story, Dana had talked a lot about the success of his father's business and his family's wealth. So Souza and his team reached out to some of Dana's friends at Santa Clara University, and a few of them said there was one person who police really needed to talk to, a recent graduate named Joel Radovich. They all said Joel was a loner and kind of a strange guy, and that he had always seemed a little obsessed with Dana. On May 8th, almost 3 weeks after the murders, Souza drove 2.5 hours from Fresno to Santa Clara to meet Joel Radovich. And when Souza had talked to Joel on the phone to arrange this meeting, he just got an odd feeling about him. Joel said he did not want police to come to his mother's house, so he would go to the motel where Souza was going to be staying. But that wasn't really what had grabbed Souza's attention. Before Souza had hung up, Joel asked him if he was going to be arrested. Souza had told Joel that, "No, I really just want to talk to you," but Souza did think it was very odd that someone would jump to the conclusion that they were being arrested right off the bat. Outside the motel, Souza saw Joel pull into the parking lot in his black Honda CRX car. Joel got out of the car and began walking over to Souza. Joel was 22 years old with bleached blonde hair. He wore a baggy long-sleeve shirt and baggy jeans. Souza introduced himself and then led Joel to a small motel room, and then they both sat down at a table that was pushed up against the wall. And before Souza could even ask a question, Joel asked again if he was going to be arrested. A look of surprise came across Souza's face, and he asked why Joel was so worried about that. Joel said that he'd actually been arrested years earlier for stealing furniture from a dorm at Santa Clara University. And since then, he said the Santa Clara police were always harassing him. Souza told Joel that he didn't have anything to do with the Santa Clara police or the stolen furniture. But Souza made a note that Joel had just admitted to having committed a robbery in the past. Souza asked Joel how he knew Dana. Joel said they had met in the dorm and hung out a few times, but that was really it. Joel was a couple of years ahead of Dana in college, so they weren't really close, and Joel said he had not kept in touch with Dana, or really anybody from school, since he had graduated a year earlier. Then Souza asked Joel where he had been on Easter Sunday. Joel immediately looked up at the ceiling like he was trying to remember something, and then he looked down and he said that he'd actually been at a paint and body shop getting some work done on his car. After chatting for a bit longer, Souza finally smiled and thanked Joel for driving all this way out to the motel to meet him, and then Joel got up and walked out of the motel. But right after Joel was gone, Souza got in touch with members of his team. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he thought Joel was hiding something. He wasn't sure the kid was a killer, but he was almost positive Joel knew more than he was saying. So Souza wanted to learn as much about him as he could. It would take months for the sheriff's department to get everything in place, but eventually they got clearance to conduct full-time surveillance on Joel. And what police learned from that surveillance operation and from digging deeper into Joel's life convinced Souza the investigation was on the right track. But Souza's process was methodical and slow, and months went by without any new information getting out to the public. So Dana and other people on the outside thought the cops just weren't doing anything. And as the investigation stretched into months and then years, even Monica's dad, the FBI agent, questioned the Fresno Sheriff's Department's techniques. But Souza, Curtis, and the rest of the team just kept blocking out the public attacks. They were confident they had the killer in their sights, but they wanted to make sure their case was airtight before they moved in. In early March of 1995, almost 3 years after the murders, Souza, Curtis, and local police officers approached a TGI Fridays restaurant in a town just outside of Los Angeles. Souza went around back to where he had a car waiting, and Curtis and the others headed inside. The music was loud inside and the place was packed, and Curtis was surprised this was where the investigation had finally led. But he and Souza were sure that the bartender working at Fridays that night was the one person who could bring the Uell murder case to a close. Curtis weaved around a few tables and moved out of the way of the server, but he never took his eyes off the bartender. And the bartender eventually looked up and saw Curtis coming his way. The bartender immediately began scanning around the room like he was looking for his exit, but he could tell there was just no way he could make a run for it. So Curtis and the other cops walked up to the bartender and told him they needed to talk. The bartender got a look on his face like he knew he'd been caught. Then police led him out through the kitchen to a parking lot behind the restaurant, and they put him in the car where Souza was waiting for him. And when Souza was done talking to this bartender, police would finally know who had killed Dale, Glee, and Tiffany, and how they had done it. Based on information provided by the bartender, evidence found at the murder scene, and details from interviews carried out during the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened the day someone murdered the Uell family on April 19, 1992. On the night of April 18th, so the day before the murders, the killer watched steam rise from their shower. While the hot water ran, the killer stepped into the shower and covered their body in shaving cream. Then they reached down with their right hand, grabbed a disposable razor from the side of the shower, and ran the blade over the hair on their left forearm. A few minutes later, they rinsed the razor off under the hot water, they bent down, and started shaving the hair on their left leg. The process took a long time, but eventually the killer had removed all of their body hair except for their eyebrows and the hair on their head. After they were done, they stepped out of the shower and dried off. Before sunrise on April 19th, the following morning, the killer got dressed in all black, wore a knit hat to cover the hair on their head, and slipped on a pair of latex gloves. The killer walked outside and put a large backpack as well as an unloaded semi-automatic 9mm gun in the back seat of the car. Then the killer drove to the Uell's neighborhood. When they arrived, they drove past the Uell's house and parked their car a few blocks away. They grabbed the backpack and the gun, got out of the car, closed the door, and moved quickly through the darkness to the Uell's house. Once the killer got there, they walked around to the backyard that was surrounded by a low cinder block fence. They dropped their bag and the gun into the backyard, and then climbed over the fence, they grabbed their things, and then ran to a small shed in the backyard and stepped inside. The killer had studied everything about the house, and they knew there was a spare key on the floor of the shed. So they pulled a flashlight out of their bag, they found the key, they grabbed it, and then darted across the yard towards the back door. The killer unlocked the door and walked inside. The house was dark, but the killer found their way to Dale and Glee's bedroom. They turned on the light, opened their backpack, and pulled out a large plastic sheet and unrolled the sheet across the floor. Then the killer put their gun down on the plastic sheet. They walked across the room to a jewelry box, they emptied it and put the stolen jewelry in their backpack. The killer then sat down on the plastic sheet, they reached into their backpack again and pulled out ammunition as well as a homemade silencer made with PVC pipe and several tennis balls that had been cut in half. The killer loaded their gun and attached the homemade silencer to it. Then they sat there on the plastic sheet and waited patiently for someone to come home. Several hours later, at about 5 p.m., the killer heard the garage door open. The killer felt butterflies in their stomach and a jolt of nervous energy. They grabbed their gun, they ran down the hall, and crouched down in a room that was across from the kitchen. The killer could hear a door open and then also Glee and Tiffany talking. The killer tried to control their breath and told themselves to stay calm and just wait for the right moment. Then, Tiffany walked past the killer in the hall and went into the kitchen. The killer immediately sprung up from their hiding spot, walked down the hall after her, and then pointed the gun into the kitchen and fired. The bullet hit Tiffany in the back of the head. Tiffany's drink flew from her hand, blood splashed onto the walls and floor, and she fell face down. Tiffany had died almost instantly. The killer heard Glee say something from another room, so they spun around in the hall. Then Glee came around the corner and saw the killer. Glee screamed, she turned and started to run away, but the killer fired off 3 shots in her direction, and Glee stumbled into the office nearby. The killer ran down the hall to the office and saw Glee lying on her side and bleeding, but she was still breathing, so the killer aimed and shot Glee just below the eye. The killer was breathing fast now. They walked away from Glee's body and went to hide in the room near the kitchen, where they tried to calm down and got ready to wait some more. About 30 minutes later, the killer heard the garage door open again. The sound of the door had made them tense up, and so they stood and raised their gun and got ready for the next killing. The killer heard Dale walk into the house, and then when Dale walked down that hallway right past the killer stepped out of their hiding place, raised their gun, and shot Dale in the back of the neck. Dale immediately crumpled to the floor, and newspapers he'd picked up from the front yard scattered all around him. Dale died in the hallway before ever seeing the bodies of his wife and daughter. The killer walked forward, kneeled down, and got a close look at Dale to make sure he really was dead. Satisfied, the killer grabbed Dale's wallet out of his pants pocket, slipped Dale's cash and credit cards into their own pockets, and then dropped the wallet back on the floor. Then the killer rushed through the house, emptying drawers and cabinets, knocking stuff off of tables, and trying to make the scene look like a random burglary as much as possible. Then the killer ran to the main bedroom, rolled up their plastic sheet, and put it in their backpack. Then they walked out of the house through the backyard, put the key back where they had found it in the shed, and climbed over the fence away from the property. The killer did their best to move fast through the neighborhood without drawing any attention to themselves. They made it back to their car, they hopped in, and they sped away. A few minutes later, they pulled onto the highway and left Fresno behind. When they finally made it home, they sat down in their bed and waited for the phone to ring, because they knew Dana Uell would be in touch soon. Joel Radovich, the young man Souza had never trusted, murdered Dale, Glee, and Tiffany. But Joel had carried these murders out at Dana Uell's request. It would turn out that despite what Joel had told Souza, he and Dana were close friends. In fact, some people said they were almost inseparable. And according to some of their classmates, Dana and Joel seemed to lack any sense of morality. They had convinced themselves there was no difference between right and wrong, and so any action, even murder, could be justified. And Dana wanted to murder his parents and his sister because with all of them gone, he would inherit $8 million and his father's company. Dana didn't just want to follow in his father's footsteps, he wanted to replace his father. In fact, in the story Dana's college newspaper had written about him, Dana claimed to be the brains behind his father's successful airplane business, and he even implied he was running the company while going to college. So Dana had offered Joel $4 million of the inheritance he was sure to get if Joel would kill his family. Dana had given Joel a layout of the house and said he would leave a key in the shed for him and told him how to disable the alarm system. Joel had accepted the deal. Then he bought a book called Hitman, a technical manual for independent contractors, to help him plan the perfect murders. The book had led Joel to shave off all of his body hair so he wouldn't leave any hair behind at the crime scene, which could then be used as DNA evidence. And the book suggested using a gun and a homemade silencer that could not be traced back to the shooter. But Joel needed help with that part of the plan, so he had turned to his good friend, the TGI Fridays bartender, who was an avid gun collector. The bartender had given Joel a semi-automatic 9mm, and he had helped Joel build the silencer. The tennis balls used in the silencer had left these strange yellow fibers on all the bodies. Then, after the murders, the bartender got the gun back, broke it apart, and buried the pieces in different places. And while that was all happening, Dana Uell had called his father's office, and he had talked to his girlfriend's FBI agent father, all to throw off suspicion and to make people believe he, the son, was truly worried about his family and wanted justice for them. And Dana's tactics had worked for a little while, because it turned out that Souza was almost positive Joel Radovich had murdered the Uells not long after they had met in the motel. But it took some serious digging before the investigators became convinced that Dana Uell was the person behind his family's murder. And putting all the pieces together and getting an airtight case against Dana took a long time. But finally, surveillance on Joel had led police to the TGI Fridays bartender, and after they cornered him at work, the bartender told police he knew everything about the murders and he admitted his part in them. Then he led police to the place where he had buried the barrel of the gun that was used in the murders, and he agreed to testify against Joel and Dana in court. The bartender was ultimately granted immunity for his testimony, and as of 2023, he works as an attorney in California. As for Joel and Dana, they were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Dale, Glee, and Tiffany are all buried next to each other in Fresno. The epitaph on all three of their headstones reads, "Together Forever." On January 23, 1989, a mother was cooking dinner in her home in Rochester, New York, when her 11-year-old daughter came into the kitchen. The daughter had just finished delivering newspapers along her delivery route in their quiet suburban neighborhood, and so her mother asked her the same nightly question, "How was the route?" And usually, the daughter replied with just a, "Good." But tonight was different. Instead, her daughter said, "It's okay." And the mother pried, like, "Well, what do you mean? What happened?" And the daughter said, "Well, I saw something strange." She told her mom that she delivered newspapers to this one particular old man. He was very nice, and he always waved to her whenever she went by, and tonight was no different. He had waved to her, but there was just something off about the way he was sitting. The mother asked, "What do you mean?" And the daughter, she really struggled to articulate what she had seen. One, it was dark. Two, the man was sitting inside of a screened-in porch that kind of obscured her view, and the awnings were pretty low, making it hard to look in. But she said basically when she had gone past, the man had waved to her like normal, but his legs appeared to be straight up in the air, like he was sitting on a chair and his legs were like up, vertical, right in front of him.
In fact, when he waved, it was like he was waving between his legs at her. And so when the mother heard this, she really didn't know what to make of it. I mean, the story didn't make any sense. She couldn't really understand how this guy was sitting where his legs would be straight up in the air like that. But at the same time, she could tell her daughter was worried, and, she kind of figured that maybe her daughter's imagination had run wild here. And so she told her daughter, like, hey, look, if he waved to you, then I'm sure everything is just fine. Don't worry about it. But the following night, when the girl came back from her route once again, she was even more upset about this guy out on his porch. She told her mom that once again she looked in the porch and there he was sitting there with his legs straight up in the air, except this time he didn't wave to her, including when she made a point to stop and wave at him. He did not wave back. Now, the girl told her mom that she was worried about him, and so she went right up to the door to go check on him, but the screened-in porch was locked, so she couldn't get inside, and, her view was kind of obscured because of the screen, so she couldn't really see him in there, but, she didn't know what to do, so she just left. Now, this story, which was already weird, now did seem a whole lot weirder that 2 days in a row her daughter is seeing this, but the mother's thinking to herself, like, come on, this is just some older guy who loves this chair and, he's fallen asleep in some weird position here, and, my daughter's sort of exaggerating what she's seeing, like, this can't be a big deal here. But, again, seeing the concern on her daughter's face, she told her daughter, look, don't worry about it, I'm sure everything's fine, I will go by tomorrow morning and make sure he's okay. So the next morning, a little before 11 a.m., the mother arrived on the street where this old man lived. And as she was walking down the road towards the house, she actually spotted the mailman. And so before she went any farther, she flagged the mailman down and she asked him, like, hey, is there anything weird going on with that old guy who lives right over there? But the mailman was like, no, he's just a nice older guy who waves at everybody who goes by. And so the mother thanked the mailman and did give some thought to just, taking what the mailman said and turning back around and heading home and telling her daughter everything's fine. But, she knew her daughter was really worried about this guy. And so she decided she would just continue down the road and check on this guy for herself and just really make sure he's okay and then report back to her daughter. And also the mother was thinking, it's about 20 degrees outside. It's very cold. This is not really a good time for an older man to be outside so much. So what's he doing? Like, let's really make sure he's okay. And so the mother made her way down the road and she reached the old man's house. And sure enough, the screened-in porch really did obscure, whoever was inside of it. She could see a silhouette of what appeared to be this old man sitting there. But the first thing she actually noticed was not him, but rather the 2 newspapers that were sitting right on his walkway, uncollected. I mean, these are the newspapers that her daughter had left over the same period of time that she's seeing this weird thing happening with this guy. And so suddenly the woman's feeling like that's a pretty big red flag. And so she hustled her way right up towards the front. And as she did, she looked into the screen porch and waved at this old man to try to get his attention, like, hey, are you okay in there? But the man did not wave back. And so the mother went right up to the door and she checked it, but like her daughter had said, it was locked. And so the mother, she pressed her face up against the mesh screen that kind of had been obscuring her view from a distance. And she put her face right up against the screen where she would have a clear view inside. And when she did, and she saw the old man who was in fact right there, and he did in fact have his legs up, when she saw him, she realized what was actually going on. And the second she did, she jumped back, turned around, and ran away to go call the police. It would turn out the old man who lived there, whose name was Robert Ham, and he was 73 years old, he was not just eccentric and sitting weirdly on his front porch. Instead, on January 23rd, right before that little girl had come home and told her mother that this man had been acting strangely, on that evening, Robert had come out onto his screened-in porch, and for whatever reason, he had attempted to sit down on this trash can that was out there on the porch. But the lid didn't hold. And so Robert fell butt first into this trash can, folding him up into this V position where his legs were straight up in front of him. And Robert was too weak to get himself out of the trash can. And also because of being in this V position where his legs were pressed up against his torso, it was restricting his ability to breathe and to make any sound. And so all he could do in this position was just wave at passerby, hoping they would see he was in trouble and go help him. But unfortunately, nobody could really tell what he was doing, including the little girl on the paper route. They just thought there was this guy sitting in his porch in this weird position, waving to people, when in reality, he was dying. And so unfortunately, because nobody came to his aid, Robert did die. He would die of a heart attack, and in fact, by the time that little girl's mother arrived at his house and put her face up against the screen, Robert was already dead. Our next story is called Lookout. On July 10, 1941, a brand new British submarine was commissioned called HMS Umpire. 9 days later, on July 19th, the submarine and her crew were told to meet up with a convoy moving north along the Medway River in England and make their way to Scotland. So Umpire joined up with the convoy, but then they started having engine problems that night, and they began drifting back behind the convoy until they were basically not in the convoy anymore at all. During this time, the commander of the submarine was up in the bridge, which is the area that controls the submarine when it's above surface, just above the wing. The captain of the Umpire was concerned this convoy would not see them when they came through because they were a submarine, so they're sitting low in the water and they're already all dark. They have no lights on the outside on purpose because this was during World War II and they didn't want German ships or planes to spot them. And because of their engine problems, they had drifted away from their convoy, which would have been protection. So the captain decides to deviate from their course to get the submarine clearly out of the way of this convoy. And so when he started turning the submarine, the steering broke, leaving the submarine now turned so its entire side is now facing this convoy, and they were still drifting directly towards this convoy. And so sure enough, before the captain could do anything, one of the larger ships struck the side of the submarine, immediately flooding their forward torpedo room. And for a brief second, the submarine and the ship were kind of mangled together, and then it slipped off the ship and it sunk all the way to the bottom, 18 meters down. The captain, along with the other 3 men that were up on the bridge with him when they were struck, they managed to leap out at the last second and were treading water when this all happened. As for the other 34 crew members, they were stuck inside when it sunk. A number of the crew had been sleeping at the time of the crash, and so all they felt was this crash, the power goes out, they leap out of their beds, and they're landing in waist-deep water, and they're running out into the halls kind of fumbling around because they can't see anything, and all they can hear is the sound of water pouring inside of their submarine. And so these sailors had gone through all sorts of drills to prepare for this type of scenario where, power's out and you're sinking, and so they know by touch how to get to the one area that has an escape hatch, which is the engine room. And after 20 of them got inside the engine room, the water levels in the hallway were getting so high that it was spilling into that room. And it was getting to the point where if they didn't seal the door, they were going to flood this one room that was their only chance of survival. And so they had to make the heartbreaking decision to lock and seal that door, meaning the 14 other sailors on the other side, if they hadn't already died, were now condemned. But for the 20 men who now were going to be able to use this escape hatch, there was no guarantee that would work. Because to use the escape hatch on a submarine, you need to understand how it works. You can't just open a hatch on a submarine. It won't open. The pressure from the seawater presses down on it to where it literally cannot open. You might be able to open it a crack if you use a tool, but that's about it. In order to open the escape hatch, you need to use something called a lockout chamber. And so a lockout chamber is like this really tight claustrophobia-inducing thing that looks an awful lot like a gas chamber, where you step through one hatch and you shut it and you seal it so it's watertight, and then above you is your escape hatch. But you can't open it until the pressure inside of the chamber has been equalized. And the way they do that is they flood the inside of the chamber the escapee is in. And so you're standing inside of this tight space, totally sealed in, and there's a control panel inside the chamber itself and also inside the sub, if you're lucky enough to have someone do that for you. You turn on the chamber, at which point water is dumped inside of this tight space you're in until it's completely full and you're holding your breath, at which point you've now equalized. The pressure inside the chamber is equal to that outside, and you can actually open the hatch. So the person inside on a breath hold undoes the hatch, opens it up, and then hopefully your swim isn't too far because you're already on a breath hold, and you swim to the surface. And during World War II, submariners were outfitted with a special piece of equipment if they ever needed to leave via the escape hatch, and it was their Davis escape gear, which is basically this life jacket that's uninflated, and when you manually activate it, it suddenly inflates, and so when you go through that hatch, you would activate it, and it would assist you to get to the surface. And so after those 20 sailors had decided to seal off the engine room, they immediately shifted focus and began getting guys into the escape hatch. And one of their most junior sailors, a guy by the name of Killian, said he would stay inside the room and operate the control panel so everybody else had the best chance of getting out of the escape hatch. And so sure enough, he put all 19 into the hatch and he got them out of the submarine. And then he, on his own, had to get in the hatch, seal it himself, and control the panel in total darkness, flood the space, open it up, and shoot to the surface. He would live and he would be awarded the British Empire Medal for bravery. One junior officer named Edward Jones was one of the 14 men that did not get to the engine room before they sealed it off. And when he got there and realized the situation, he turned around and looked down the hall, and there were only 3 other men that were standing there. And he didn't know how many had made it in the engine room. He figured this was the only 4 that had not made the cut. But in fact, there was actually 10 other people that were just stuck in various places inside of the submarine. But Jones decided he only had these guys in front of him, and so he said, "Hey, come with me, I have an idea." As Jones led them down this hallway, the water levels had risen up to their necks, and all these circuits on the walls were starting to spark all around them. And so Jones led them to the middle of the submarine, and then he turned and went up into the control room, and then from the control room, he went even farther up into what's called the conning tower. The conning tower is a submarine's main attack center. It's where you have those periscopes they look around in, and it also has the firing buttons for their torpedoes. It is not designed to be an escape hatch, because once you flood the conning tower, there's no control panel like there is on an escape hatch to drain the water that was used to equalize in order to open the hatch. So once the water's in, it's either you get to the surface or you drown. Also, in order to exit out of the conning tower, you need to go through this very narrow tube that goes straight up, and it's got a ladder through it that can barely fit one person climbing up. Meaning the people at the bottom of the ladder will have to hold their breath a lot longer than the people at the top. So Jones and the other 3 sailors, they get to the conning tower and they seal the hatch at their feet, so blocking the hallway flood from coming into where they are. And they realize that even though they have to do this, there are no other alternatives here, that realistically 1 or 2 or more are going to die in the process of just trying to get out of the submarine. But it was all they could do, so they made peace with their decision. They climbed up and they opened the hatch just enough to let water come in, but quite a bit started coming in. The men wedged themselves as high up in the tunnel as they possibly could, but obviously not everybody could get all the way up to the hatch. And so 2 were down low, and Edward Jones and 1 other were up towards the top. And Jones would say that at first they were talking and praying, and then when they started feeling the water get closer and closer to their heads, they went silent. And then Jones remembers keeping his hand on the 1 man that was below him, and when his hand was wet, he knew the 2 men below him were completely submerged, and then the water came up to his face, covered his head, and at that point he opened it up and they swam out. Of the 4 men in the conning tower, only Edward Jones and the other guy who was high up in the tunnel with him made it to the surface. All told, only 14 of the 38 total crew survived the accident.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Wrong Button. At 8:30 p.m. on August 20th, 2010, a 76-year-old man named Zhang walked through the streets of New Taipei City, which is a major city in northern Taiwan. Zhang was on the end of an evening walk, and he was making his way back towards his daughter's apartment, where he was also staying. And as Zhang neared the apartment, he happened to notice there was a street lamp right outside with this big poster attached to it that he hadn't seen before. And as he got closer, he saw there was also this picture of this middle-aged woman whose name was Chun Yan Chui, and apparently she was missing. And not only that, she also lived in the same building that his daughter lived in. Except Chun was actually a dementia patient, and she was staying on the 5th floor of this apartment building complex where there was this memory care facility, and that's where she was being taken care of. And about a week earlier, she had gone out for an evening walk, this is what it said on the poster, and just not returned. And so since the week before, police had been out looking for her and her family and friends. They were putting these posters up, and it was clear, nobody had found her yet. Now, Zhang had never met this woman, but he sort of felt bad for her. And so he found himself staring at this picture and trying to memorize her face, in the off chance that he just saw her somewhere. He could report her to the authorities and hopefully get her rescued. And so after staring at the picture for a little bit longer and sort of feeling bad for this woman, Zhang turned and just continued inside the apartment building. And once he was in the apartment building, he made his way over to the elevator, he hit the up button, and he waited, and then a moment later, there was a ding and the doors opened up. He stepped onto the elevator, he pressed the button, the doors closed, and then Zhang waited as he headed up to his daughter's apartment on the 7th floor. But as he was going up, he noticed he had accidentally hit the 6th floor, not the 7th floor. And right at that moment, he saw that he was reaching the 6th floor, and so the elevator car was slowing down. And so he just was like, oh, whoops, and he hit floor 7. But by the time he hit floor 7, the car had come to a stop on floor 6, and the doors were opening.
Like it would need to reset. Doors open on 6, they close, and then he'd go to 7. Like this is no big deal. And so Zhang is just waiting, for these doors to open, shut, and go up one more floor. However, when the doors opened on floor 6, Zhang is looking straight out and he could not believe what he saw. And he just began to scream. Around the same time this was happening, Zhang's daughter was finishing up her shift at work when she got a phone call. And she saw it was coming from her dad, and he rarely called her when she was at work. So this was sort of confusing and surprising. And so right away she picked it up and she answered. And immediately she hears her dad screaming incoherently. He's obviously terrified. And all Zhang's daughter can hear is that her dad is saying he's trapped. He's trapped in an elevator and he doesn't know what to do. And so, Zhang's daughter is getting scared just based on what her dad sounds like. She doesn't really know what's going on, but she told her dad, like, okay, I'll call the building. We'll get you some help. Like, stay calm. You're going to be okay. But her dad just continued rambling and he was totally incoherent. And eventually, Zhang's daughter just said, okay, dad, like, just hang tight. I'm going to get you some help. And then she hung up, and then she immediately called her apartment building's administration and emergency services line and told them, hey, I think my dad is stuck on one of your elevator cars. He's really upset. Can you please help him? And after getting the emergency services to, get spun up into action to go save her dad, Zhang's daughter left work, hopped in her car, and began rushing home. It would take Zhang's daughter about 40 minutes to get back to her apartment. And by the time she got there, she fully expected her dad would be safely out of the elevator. I mean, he was obviously very upset, but she had called the building. They were on it. They were going to get him out. But when she went inside the lobby of the apartment building, she saw a crowd of police officers just standing there. She didn't see her dad anywhere. And before she could even ask any questions, she noticed one of the officers was on the phone. And clearly, just based on what was being said by this officer, he was talking to her father. Like he was talking to somebody who was hysterical, and this officer was doing his best to try to calm him down and sort of talk him through what was happening. And so Zhang's daughter immediately walks up to this officer and says, hey, I'm his daughter, the guy who's stuck in the elevator, I'm his daughter. What's going on? I would have figured he'd be out by now. Like, what's happened? At this point, one of the officers confirms that, this really is this man's daughter, and he pulls her aside and he explains to her that, yes, your dad is still in the elevator because we can't get him out. The reality is this is not a normal situation here. He's trapped in there, and really the only way for him to get out is for him to do something really specific. Like us and the building staff, we can't do anything. He has to do this one really specific thing, and right now he's refusing to do it. He's too panicked, he's too scared. We're trying to calm him down, but it's not working. And so Zhang's daughter asked this officer, can you please explain to me what you're talking about? What is this specific thing you want him to do? I don't get it. And at that point, the officer kind of composed himself and explained to the daughter, what was really going on inside of that elevator car. And after Zhang's daughter heard it, she was horrified, and she immediately understood why her dad was so upset and unwilling to do this one particular thing that would save him, but would be pretty awful. She got it, but she knew she would have to hop on the phone and convince her dad that he had to do it, there was no other way. And so she walked over to the officer who was on the phone with her dad. She took the phone and she began talking her dad through, what he really needed to do here. She basically gave him a pep talk and said, Dad, for me, you got to find the strength and do this thing and get out of there. And sure enough, just a couple of minutes later, the elevator doors in the lobby chimed and opened up, and Zhang came stumbling out. He looked horrible, disheveled, but he was okay. And right away, police officers rushed towards him, but they bypassed him and went into the elevator and immediately surrounded something in the elevator car. It would turn out that missing woman, Chen Yanshui, the woman who was on that poster that Zhang saw before he walked into the apartment building, well, she really had gone missing a week earlier on her evening walk. But everybody thought she got lost while she was on that walk because she was a dementia patient, and so, she had memory issues. But the reality was, she actually did come back to her apartment. However, when she got on the elevator, she actually made the same mistake that Zhang did. Now, she was not trying to get to the 7th floor, she was trying to get to the 5th floor, but she accidentally pressed the 6th floor. So up she goes, she gets to the 6th floor, the doors open up, she steps off the elevator car, and she's immediately completely confused. And for what it's worth, it didn't matter that she had dementia. Anybody who got off on the 6th floor would likely be confused if you had never been to this building before, because the 6th floor was actually a private residence, and the person who lived on that floor was so worried about people breaking into their private residence that they had installed a metal gate in front of the elevator doors. And so unless you had the key to get through this gate, when you got off on the 6th floor, you basically would step onto a little platform that basically is the hallway leading into the 6th floor, and then you'd be hit with the gate. And so that's exactly what happened to Chun. She got off on the 6th floor, maybe thinking this is the 5th floor. She stepped onto that little narrow strip that you could actually stand on the 6th floor before you reached the gate. And then as she was trying to figure out, like, where am I? This isn't the 5th floor. This doesn't make any sense. There's a gate in front of me. The doors to the elevator closed. And she had no way to open them up again because the buttons to access the elevator were beyond the gate. And so suddenly Chun is standing in this narrow space, the doors have closed behind her, and she can't do anything. She's trapped between the gate and the elevator doors. And even though people are using this elevator right behind her, the only person who would come to the 6th floor is the owner of that residence, and they were on vacation. And so for days and days, Chun is just trapped basically in between the gate and the elevator with no one having any idea she was there. She's calling out, she's doing everything she can to get somebody's attention, but nobody can hear her. And after 5 days of this, when the owner of this residence didn't come home because they were on vacation, she eventually died because she didn't have food or water or anything. She was just standing there for 5 days. And then a couple of days later, Jong accidentally rides to the 6th floor. He's like, oh shoot, I need to go to 7. He hits 7, but the doors open on 6. And when they do, Chun's body, which had been basically frozen in this standing position, fell backwards onto him, pinned him to the ground. He starts screaming and freaking out. He gets out from underneath her, but her body, which was in rigor mortis at this point, is stiff, and she was lying like a board on the ground with her feet jutting out onto the 6th floor and her upper half inside of the elevator. And so she was blocking the doors from closing. And so Jong is freaking out. He's calling his daughter. He can't believe this. There's this dead person in here. And eventually police get involved and they tell Jong, you just gotta move the body so the doors will close. But again, her body is heavy and it's stiff and she's obviously deceased. She's starting to decompose and Jong basically couldn't handle it and he was unwilling to move her body until his daughter hopped on the phone and said, you gotta do it. At which point, he managed to lift her up, get her out of the way, and kind of push her off to the side of the elevator car. He rode down to the bottom, at which point the police came in and handled the situation. Now, the owner of the 6th floor residence was not held criminally responsible, despite putting that gate up that created this trap that killed Chun. However, despite that, he would end up paying Chun's family about $97,000 equivalent just to compensate for her death.
While the town on the cliff is fast asleep, I'm watching the horizon, straining my eyes for the tattered black sails and the captain's lies. They told me keep the fire, keep the warning bright, but I'm feeling kinda lonely on the edge tonight. Rules are for the living, safety is a bore. I want the phantom ocean knocking at my door. So I climb the spiral stairs, breathing in the salt. If they crash upon the granite, hey, it's not my fault. The bulb is humming loud, like a second sun. Grab the hammer.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.
The Mr. Ballin podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballin. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone, research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear.